When Ichigo first emerged from the Dangai at the tail end of the Arrancar arc all those years ago, it was maybe the coolest, most exciting moment in Bleach, at least for a long time. Not only did he look awesome with his hair having grown out during his 3 months training in isolation, but this was one of those rare instances where a character's mere appearance absolutely radiated strength, and their mere arrival promised power on a scale we had never seen before. And of course, both Kubo and Ichigo delivered on that promise in a huge way, as Ichigo proceeded to not only defeat a Transcendent aizen, but, well, embarrass him in what is still, I would say, the greatest demonstration of overwhelming might the series has ever seen, between two characters at the absolute summit of power, especially for the time. Since then, however, many years have passed, and it feels as though Dangai Ichigo is no longer on people's radar, that he no longer gets the respect the character, the form, really deserves. And truth be told, I guess it's not hard to see why. Ichigo's Dangai transformation was only around for a few chapters, a precious few chapters, and his ultimate form, the final Getsuga Tenshou, was around for even less. And that took place many, many years ago at this point. The conversation has long since moved on. Since then, Ichigo has regained his lost Shinigami powers and embarked on what feels like a wholly new path to power in the Thousand Year Blood War arc. An arc which itself, let's face it, totally rewrote the rules on power in Bleach, not just for Ichigo, but for so many characters. The new villains were stronger and more broken than ever before, some of the series' outright craziest and most powerful characters were introduced, and well, it's easy to look back on the Arrancar arc as a frankly much quainter time, where the stakes felt lower, and the characters not quite as busted. But what if I told you that Dangai Ichigo and true Bankai Ichigo are way more similar than you might think? The Blade is Me felt like an exciting revelation in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, a moment of enlightenment, not just for Ichigo but for the reader too, as the relationship between Shinigami and Zanpakutō was finally fleshed out, brought into the spotlight, and Ichigo's development came full circle in a way that was genuinely satisfying. But the truth is, we've been here before. Although not said in quite so many words, and certainly not in such a forthcoming way, Ichigo's training during the Deicide arc mirrors the themes and ideas brought to the forefront by The Blade is Me, and over a considerably longer period of time too. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Dangai Ichigo has performed some of the most absurd feats we have ever seen in the manga, a level of power that was completely unknown to us before, and if I'm honest, for the most part, frankly hasn't been seen since. So let's take a closer look at Dangai Ichigo and his true power. A power that was once lost, but it feels as though Ichigo has gained once again. What truly are the differences between Dangai Ichigo and the Ichigo of the Thousand Year Blood War arc, if any, and what do they mean for his growth overall? Let's take a look. Of course, before we get started, consider hitting subscribe down below. If you haven't done it already, it does help out enormously on our journey to 300,000 subscribers by the end of the year. I really would appreciate it. And of course, check out my Patreon as well if you want to support the channel that extra step further. But again, regardless, just the fact you're here discussing Bleach with me today is all the support I could ever ask for. Oh yes, and since we will be discussing Ichigo's true Bankai, it kind of feels like everyone knows what it is at this point, but in case you don't, there are spoilers for the remainder of the Thousand Year Blood War arc anime in this video to come. Now, to discuss this form of Ichigo's, we have to accept the fact that Dangai Ichigo is a somewhat problematic character to look at these days, because there's no escaping the fact that at least some part of this transformation is built on a lie. But I would counter that by saying the depth of the lie is overstated. It is superficial, and its impact isn't that important in the grand scheme of things, because this form, Dangai Ichigo, is all-encompassing anyway. Plus, both Zangetsu and Ichigo take the exact same approach to this that I do, as Zangetsu himself tells Ichigo in chapter 541, and I quote, There are no lies in my words or in my heart. The name I spoke to you is the sole exception. In the following chapter, Ichigo, having come to a true understanding of the nature of both his powers and his Zanpakutō, and himself, accepts that answer, reflecting on the fact that yes, there were no lies, neither from Old Man Zangetsu nor White. The point of this acceptance, this self-acceptance on Ichigo's part, was to avoid invalidating everything that came before. It was kind of a meta move by Kubo, because there's no doubt about it. The twist that Old Man Zangetsu wasn't who he said he was perhaps the single biggest and most devastating twist in all of Bleach, because of how it had the potential to upend everything. We not only thought we knew about our main character, but his entire journey to date. I certainly wouldn't be surprised if it was the twist Kubo himself was perhaps the most nervous to implement, to see the community readership reaction to. So, what I'm getting at is that during The Blade Is Me, Ichigo reaffirms that everything he's undergone so far has been very real, and with both Zangetsu and White speaking nothing but the truth, save for their names, we don't have to look at the past through a distorted lens. Dangai Ichigo, the basis of that power, and the power he wielded, was all real, and it was all truth. And that power was, at times, genuinely unbelievable, even in the frame of today, in the frame of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. This was Ichigo on a level at which we had never seen him at before, not even close, and again, like I said, honestly, it feels like we've never even seen again since. Now, I want to get into the differences between this version of Ichigo and his 1,000-Year Blood War arc self, or the similarities perhaps to be more accurate, specifically his true bankai, towards the end of the video, because there are mechanical differences to be sure, but as far as big, flashy shows of power, and a mastery over said power go, this is like nothing else. Remember as well that context is key, and like several other characters I've talked about on this channel, there is an inherent difficulty in truly gauging Dangai Ichigo's power, or the ceiling of his power anyway, because of the very specific and situational nature in which this form is used in the story. It's literally only used to fight Aizen, and a transcendent Aizen at that, one who has surpassed what it means to be both Shinigami and Hollow. At this point in the story, this form of Aizen was the strongest character we had ever known by some margin, and again, this is another form I would like to discuss in the future. In fact, I just recently made a video looking at Aizen's newfound strength in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, and it's not as straightforward as just saying he's more powerful in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc than he was here. Sure, he is, in some respects, as Kisuke Urahara himself even notes, but the truth behind that is that he has also forfeited a lot of the power, the extraneous power that came with this transcendence, a lot of the more unique aspects of this strength that made him such a difficult and unusual opponent in the first place. Circling back to Dangai Ichigo, I think it's easy to forget about the minutiae of what Ichigo actually achieved with this form. Take his physical strength, for example, his Hakuda, an often underrated element of a Bleach character's fighting skill set, I think simply because it's not the flashiest or the most impressive on the page, and it's not necessarily the easiest to quantify either. But this was, again, just something else entirely. Let's jump back to Aizen. Prior to his transcendence, Aizen had such immense physical strength that he destroyed Komamura's Bankai in a single hit, and took out most of the captain-class members of the Gotei 13 and the Vizard again with just a swing of his sword. It feels underplayed, but it's a real testament to his incredible unmatched strength, and this is only heightened when he transcends, along with everything else he can do. In one of the most famous and cathartic moments in Bleach, Dangai Ichigo moves so fast and acts with such wanton physical superiority that he grabs Aizen's face, taking him completely by surprise, literally lifts him into the air, and propels him away from Karakura Town in the blink of an eye, before then casually launching him down to the ground like a missile. And it's not that Aizen is unaware of what's going on at the time, but he cannot do anything about it. It reminds me of when Yami throws Rukia to the ground in his Resurrection, and she literally can't fight the sheer force of the wind, as she nearly dies as a result. This is very similar, albeit on an even grander scale. And Aizen is so dumbfounded by this that he spends the next portion of the fight monologuing an excuse as to why this was even possible. He believes that Ichigo relinquished his spirit energy in order to convert it into raw physical power, but of course this is total nonsense. Dangai Ichigo is just that powerful, just that fast, on top of everything else. Of course, there's the famous moment where a single swing from Ichigo's sword obliterates a mountain, totally erasing the topography from existence. Again, Aizen thought it was his sword, but it wasn't. And it's totally effortless on Ichigo's part, and this is a recurring point that we will have to contend with again and again. Ichigo levels a mountain by deflecting Aizen's sword. That's what happens, as absurd as it sounds to go back and analyze this moment. But again and again, we will see throughout this video that it's not just the fact that Ichigo achieves these feats that's really truly impressive, though it is, it's the ease at which he does so. This is a very impressive moment, but it barely seems to register as a thought to Ichigo. He just turns around to meet Aizen's oncoming blade and obliterates a mountain. Also, in this moment, going back to the idea that Dangai Ichigo's power is tough to gauge due to the unique nature of these circumstances, this version of Aizen is capable of using abilities no other character had ever showcased in the series prior to this. And to be honest, after this, I think it's only Lige that can also do it. He can literally teleport. His body breaks down and reforms somewhere else, so he isn't using Flash Step. Not only has Ichigo never seen this move before, but he wouldn't be able to sense Aizen in this moment either. And yet he's so fast now that he again effortlessly barely turns around and blocks Aizen's blade. And in doing so, destroys the mountain. It's funny too, because the anime makes Ichigo look a little, not less capable per se, but less in control, perhaps in this moment. When Aizen vanishes in the anime, we get a brief shot of Ichigo kind of looking around for any trace of him before the villain reconstitutes himself. But in the manga, we don't see Ichigo's face at all after Aizen reappears because he already knows where he is. He displays a modicum of shock at the fact that Aizen can teleport in the first place, which I think is fair enough. But after that, nothing. Once he's got the lay of the land, he's like, oh, okay, that's all it is. And then, of course, we get, outside of Mugetsu itself, perhaps the single most impressive and frankly craziest display of Ichigo's power that this form has to offer, in my opinion anyway. And one that's made even more absurd thanks to the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. With Aizen finding himself on the back foot, he unleashes a fully powered Hardo 90, one with the ability to warp time and space itself. This is the exact same spell we see him use in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc to eradicate the Soul King's excess power. The only difference between the two is Aizen doesn't need to use an incantation anymore in the final arc, which showcases his newfound mastery over the spell, but aside from that they are the same. It's the same level of power, the same devastation. And Ichigo shatters it into a million pieces with his bare hand. Again, I have to emphasize, we've never seen anything like this before. Imagine in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, Aizen prepares to use Kurohitsugi to wipe out the Soul King's power, and the incredible showcase that spell has there as a result, and this version of Ichigo just walks in and swats it away like it's nothing. Not even a nuisance. What are the ramifications of this? What does this mean? As well, for Dangai Ichigo's own capabilities against the overwhelming force of Ryo's surplus power. I mean, it seems to me, while they don't necessarily line up one-to-one that evenly, it's also not out of the realm of possibility that he too could just eradicate that overflowing power with a flick of his wrist if he's outputting the kind of physical strength necessary to demolish Hado 90 with no effort whatsoever. And again, the devil is in the details here. It's not like Ichigo has to forcibly break his way out of the spell. It's not that he doesn't struggle, that's not the point here. The point here is that he doesn't even care. It would be one thing for him to have to break open the spell with his own physical strength, to pull it apart, to escape from the inside. Even doing that would have been impressive, but he just casually smashes it with a wave of his hand. That's an exponential power differential, the likes of which we have never seen, and again, we never see in the future either. And then there's Mugetsu. All of this, and we haven't even touched on the apex of Ichigo's power, wherein he literally becomes Getsuga and launches an arc of pure, unbridled darkness to consume all before it. Again, and we'll get into the granular details of the makeup of Ichigo's power in a moment, but this is representative of all of his power, including that which we were not yet aware of in the Arrancar arc. While Getsuga itself is a Shinigami ability inherited from his Shinigami father, and one he still uses even when utilizing his true Zanpakutō, it is clear that this form is simply Ichigo merging with his power, which, as we know from both Deicide and The Blade Is Me, is made up of everyone. And again, we'll get into this a little bit more in a moment, but simply by looking at the designs themselves, the progress of power, the progress of a Zanpakutō using an ability, well, the final Getsuga Tenshou is genuinely just an extension of Dangai Ichigo itself, and again, we'll get into that in a moment. People have pointed out that Ichigo's long black hair and red eyes appear to be representative of Yhwach himself, and while I think the more likely scenario is that it was the other way around, and Kubo took Ichigo's red eyes here and gave them to Yhwach to establish that connection, the reality is that yes, this can still be seen as a manifestation of Quincy power too, because again, unknowingly, Ichigo has accepted them all here. Ultimately, the real question at the end of all of this, and I'm kind of skipping ahead a bit here, but how much does it matter that Ichigo knows that Zangetsu is his Quincy power or not, when ultimately he accepts them all anyway, and the sentiment is the same? And believe me, going back to Mugetsu, Aizen was a dead man when this thing hit him were it not for the Hogyoku. Mugetsu literally splits him in two down the middle, his head included in that. The only reason he survives is thanks to the Hogyoku's power, but even then, simply being struck by Ichigo's attack dismantles Aizen's transformations up until that point. The strength is so overwhelming that it practically evaporates Aizen's own power before our eyes. We literally see Aizen's monster form crumbling away beneath Mugetsu's might as he is totally swallowed up by the void of abyssal darkness. There's a reason Ichigo, while in Aizen's grasp, surrounded on all sides by his enemy's power, can simply look at him and say, "Is this all you've got?" Obviously, it's a moment that's meant to call back to Yamamoto's own disparaging remark to Wonder Weiss earlier in the arc, but it's also designed to show how, at the height of their respective power, these villains are nothing in the face of their opponents. How helpless Aizen is before Ichigo is meant to be reflective of how helpless Wonder Weiss was before Yamamoto, and that's especially stark where Aizen is concerned, considering how powerful he truly is here. So, how exactly did Ichigo become this powerful, and what are the similarities and differences between Deicide and the journey he undergoes in the Thousand Year Blood War arc? How do they reflect one another as capstones of Ichigo's individual journeys? Look, the reality is that both Dangai Ichigo and true Bankai Ichigo can be seen as the ultimate endgame of Ichigo's respective paths, across different halves of the story. He achieves his Dangai form at the end of the Urankar arc, roughly the halfway point of the story, and then loses everything. The reset button is hit, forcing himself to start over. He then achieves his true Zanpakutō in the Thousand Year Blood War arc after learning the truth of everything he didn't know. And by the end of the Thousand Year Blood War arc, we finally get to see his true bankai. There are crucial differences, of course. Dangai Ichigo feels to me like the culmination of everything Ichigo could be, and everything he's achieved up until that point. It feels like an Ichigo who has a better grasp of his power, of the power he has known up until that point, even if he doesn't know the truth behind it. Whereas where true Bankai Ichigo is concerned, Ichigo has only had his true Bankai for all of about 3 days by the time he uses it. So there's a ton of room for growth still there, likely eventually taking him far beyond what we saw with his Dangai form. While Ichigo himself in the Thousand Year Blood War arc presents a much more in-control and mature version of himself, the reality is that his power, this new power, this true power, is still very young and still very unknown to him. In both arcs, Ichigo is forced to contend with a terrible truth in order to fully understand and accept himself. In the Deicide arc, Ichigo must accept that White is in fact a part of his power, and not some malignant entity that Ichigo can destroy and then never think about again. And it's very telling that Ichigo is so shocked to see that White is still around, that he was so sure he had gotten rid of him. This is the demon he's been trying to quash for the entire arc, and when he thinks he's achieved that, thanks to his training with the Vizard, his hollow mask is truly born. But the hollow mask itself is an aberration, a symbol of a disconnect, a fundamental misunderstanding between Ichigo and White, between Ichigo and his own power. The hollow mask is never truly a part of him. It's literally a mask. It's false. It's something he puts on and takes off again. It's no coincidence that after Deicide we never see Ichigo wearing a hollow mask again, because he's accepted that White is a part of who he is and his power. And so he doesn't need this extraneous piece to represent the hollow within. And I like that Kubo committed to that, because getting rid of the hollow mask was probably difficult for him to do. After all, it's iconic and an awesome part of Ichigo's design, but removing it is one of the purest signs of Ichigo's character development that we get. Whereas in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, Ichigo must contend with the truth that Old Man Zangetsu isn't who he says he is. He's actually Ichigo's Quincy power, not his Shinigami power, and has been suppressing his Shinigami power all this time. Bear in mind that nothing has changed between this and Deicide. In Deicide, Ichigo also faces down all of his power, he just didn't know what that really meant. Tensor Zangetsu is his Quincy power, while White is both his Shinigami and his Hollow power, rather than one representing Shinigami and the other representing Hollow, and it being as binary and simple as that. Of course, ultimately, they fuse together, becoming one being. Perhaps the truest version of Ichigo's power we have ever seen. And this is a very vital point. White Tensor, as he's known, is Ichigo's power in full. He is a way more important and influential character than I think most people realise, and that makes sense, he's barely in the story. But he is Ichigo's power unfettered, unshackled, and completely let loose, all encompassed in one form. Here, Zangetsu is no longer suppressing Ichigo's power. He is Ichigo's power, fully realised. This is the endgame, and White Tensor is aware of the fact that if Ichigo uses the final Getsuga Tenshou, he will lose all of this anyway. Remember again that key quote from the Thousand Year Blood War arc. There are no lies in my words or in my heart. The name I spoke to you is the sole exception. Again, this means everything that transpired in Deicide was truth. When Tensor told Ichigo that they are his power, he was telling the truth. He was showing him truth. It's easy to find Ichigo's journey confusing or convoluted, But it's actually one of my favourite parts of the story because despite everything, it does all come together and make perfect sense in the end. It's very satisfying. White flat out tells Ichigo during his Vizard training that he is Zangetsu. Ichigo just wasn't ready to hear it. And here, Tensa and White flat out tell Ichigo that they are one and the same. They are Ichigo's power. They show him. Really, the only difference is this idea that here in Deicide, White Tensa calls themselves Ichigo's power, whereas in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, the revelation stems from the fact that Zangetsu isn't just Ichigo's power, he literally is Ichigo. But when looking at this as a holistic whole, this is semantics. The same truth is achieved either way. Ichigo accepts the entirety of his power. He accepts the whole truth of his power as a part of who he is. The more I think about it, the more I think White Tensa is a very fascinating character. Because this is Ichigo's power all rolled into one in a very explicit way. And again, there's an argument to be had that Dangai Ichigo is still wearing a fake version of his bankai of Tensa Zangetsu, and that is true. Some of that is going to come down to Kubo's foresight, but there is more to it than that. And this is the final point I want to make on the minutiae of Ichigo's power and what constitutes it. And in my opinion, this is also the most interesting point as well. Take the chain imagery, for example. Even after acquiring his true Zanpakutō, the chain remains a fundamental part of his bankai. The tip and hilt of the true Tensa Zangetsu are connected by a chain. Here, in his Dangai form, the chain snakes up Ichigo's arm and wraps tightly around it. Yet we can see here on this page in particular that the end of the chain flows from Ichigo himself, and doesn't seem to connect to his Zanpakutō in a physical way at all. What does this mean? Well, symbolically, Ichigo is literally his Zanpakutō now. He is Zangetsu, and so his arm has become a literal extension of the sword. You have the blade, which is now fused to his hand, and the chain on the other end, which coils around his arm. Because what we're looking at is no longer a sword and an arm, it's all the Zanpakutō. The chain flows from the end of the blade up Ichigo's arm and off the other side because it's all the blade. Ichigo is one with his blade. Right now he is one with Tensa Zangetsu, and later, as I mentioned earlier, he transforms sword and all to become one with Getsuga, his body becoming his own ability. This is the most literal version of the blade is me that we ever see. And the fact that the chain remains during Ichigo's true bankai is proof that this is the same power, born of the same power, albeit taking a slightly different shape. But it is perhaps the truest form of the blade is me concept we've ever known, even if Ichigo wasn't totally clued in. Is it a little silly to say that Ichigo is a walking, talking Zanpakutō at this point? Well, no, because he absolutely is, and the same is true vice versa. Zangetsu is Ichigo as well. The point of this design is that there is no longer any differentiating the two. And again, goes back to the idea that the visuals of this form reflect the notion that from a Zanpakutō comes an ability, that natural progression. Ichigo, when he arrives on the battlefield to take on Aizen, is a Zanpakutō. When he unleashes the final Getsuga Tenshou, he becomes its ability. They flow from one another, in again a very literal sense. Honestly, it's really awesome. So, are there differences then between Dangai Ichigo and true Bankai Ichigo? Yeah, of course. With a better, clearer, more textbook understanding of the origin of his power, Ichigo has a greater mechanical knowledge of it. Now he knows that he's wielding Quincy power too, and that revelation takes the shape of his smaller blade in Shikai and the white casing in Bankai. And again, As Ichigo has only had his true bankai for a few days at best when he uses it against the Yuha arc, it feels like there is so much room for him to grow. If we do ever get a Hell arc, since it's been 10 years since the 1000-year Blood War arc, we will likely see the true potential of Tensa Zangetsu unleashed, making it easily the strongest form of Ichigo's we have ever seen. In that sense, Dangai Ichigo feels like true Bankai Ichigo, but in a much more abstract and conceptual way. He is Ichigo's power, all of Ichigo's power, fused into one and taking on a form that's almost like an abstract painting. Whereas true Bankai Ichigo is a much more mechanically correct version of that same power. Now that he has all the textbook knowledge, it can shape itself in a way that makes a lot more sense. Ichigo's body is no longer that of a literal walking Zanpakutō, but he has that power fused into actual steel that he can actually then use in battle and continue to grow stronger with. Could it be correct even then to say that true Bankai Ichigo allows Ichigo to reach the level of power he was at in his Dangai form, but just whenever he wants? Because of course Dangai Ichigo always kind of felt like a one-off. But now, maybe with his true Bankai, he can reach and eventually surpass that power through training and getting to know his new Bankai better over the course of the next decade or so, and maybe he now can access that power pretty much whenever he wants. It's difficult to say because we haven't really seen much of anything from his true Bankai yet, save from it one-shotting Soul King Yuha arc, which is probably the single most impressive thing I guess we've ever seen in one go, but it's also kind of hard for me to imagine that version of Ichigo just backhanding a Hado 90 out of existence, but maybe he could still do that. So I guess that is a good way of differentiating the two straight down the middle. Dangai Ichigo is the concept. True Bankai Ichigo is the mechanics realized. Today, I merely wanted to try and show you then that Dangai Ichigo shouldn't be written off, as it is likely much closer to true Bankai Ichigo than we ever realized. The signs are all there. And if anything, this is an Ichigo further along the evolutionary trail than we ever see again. This was Kubo showing us the blade is me in a much more literal way than we get in the 1000-year Blood War arc, but one that when taken holistically makes a ton of sense. Everything is here. Ichigo's Shinigami, Hollow, and Quincy power, and he accepts it all. In fact, in my recent Aizen video, I theorized that he had become stronger in the 1000-year Blood War arc by moving on from his Transcendent form and the stranger powers that came with it, and instead doubled down on his purely Shinigami powers for the most part, growing closer with Kyokusui Getsu and improving his Kido mastery. It kind of feels like the 1000-year Blood War arc and The Blade is Me was designed to achieve a similar thing for Ichigo. There's a narrowing of focus here. Like I said earlier, the influence of the Hollow power is almost completely gone. Of course, it's crucial to remember that it still exists, it's still there, it's very much a part of him, as it's literally fused with his Shinigami power, but from a character perspective, Ichigo feels almost completely Shinigami again. He no longer has a hollow mask, he no longer has the cross armor that was representative of his full bring, and even his Quincy power feels like it takes a back seat, manifesting in the smaller sword, or the sheath as Kubo would later call it, in an effort again to streamline the character. In the manga, Ichibei even notes that Ichigo has become a true Shinigami, and the focus of his development is on his Zanpakutō, even while the revelations surround his Quincy power. Alright everyone, but that's it for today's video. As always, I do hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you took something of value away from it as well. I'm pretty proud of this one. I think it's a pretty cool topic, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it down in the comments below. How similar is Dangai Ichigo to true Bankai Ichigo, both in terms of concept and in terms of power and ability? What do you think of the incredible, insane feats of strength and control that Ichigo seems to unleash in his Dangai form? Do you think he can still do things like that, like destroying a Hado 90 with his bare hand? I'd love to get all of your thoughts and theories down in the comments below, so do please let me know. Alright everyone, once again, consider hitting subscribe down below if you enjoyed today's video. You want to support the channel, you want to see more just like this. It's quick and easy to do if you haven't done it already, so please do consider doing so. And yeah, check out my Patreon as well. If you want to take that support from me another step further, because it does mean absolutely everything, it is helping to keep the lights on too, and you can be just like these guys who are supporting the channel that extra step further. A big, big shout out and a thank you goes out to each and every one of them. Alright guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.